I'd like to spend a moment talking about this because it underlies the work we do at the Centre and will also form the basis for the presentations that you'll hear this morning. So at the Centre, we try and take what we call a food systems approach. What does this mean? Something that we hear thrown around quite a lot. First of all, it means, and this is something we definitely saw yesterday and we've seen happening progressively over the last 5 to 10 years, that we don't just equate food and nutrition security with producing more food and focus only on agricultural production. We understand that getting the food that we need at the right time, the right quantity, and the right quality involves an entire value chain. These value chains are very diverse, they're structured very differently in different parts of the world, and involve multitude of different steps and different actors to get the food where we need it. So this is understanding that from agricultural production through to post-consumption, there are a lot of complex issues and actors to deal with. As we saw yesterday, it's not just about the value chain, it's understanding that we don't just need resources in agricultural production in terms of land, water, labour, but indeed we require resources the entire way through this value chain. And at the same time, we see a lot of these resources ending up as either losses or waste, again, throughout this system, depending on the particular context. In some cases, we're seeing work happening to try and close this loop, particularly regarding nutrients, so that we're starting to create closed systems. But we need to move beyond this to understand that these value chains in all these different contexts are influenced by a broad variety of factors, what we call boundary conditions. These are the environmental, political, social, and economic conditions that form the boundaries of a particular unit of analysis that we're working with. And these obviously not only interact in a very complex fashion with one another, but with all of the elements of the value chain. So when we're talking about food systems, we're understanding these elements, the activities, the inputs and the outputs, the interactions and feedbacks with these boundary conditions and global change drivers. And what's really important is how all of these elements work together to deliver what we call food system outcomes. And that's namely food and nutrition security, considering these 4 aspects of availability, access, use, and stability. And of course, environmental quality and social well-being. So it's our conviction that food systems should deliver these 3 outcomes. And unfortunately, we see in many parts of the world today, that's not the case at all. So within this complex number of elements, there are of course many different actors with many different interests, and we believe that it's really important to work together to understand how all of this interacts with one another and to start to develop solutions that can optimize these outcomes and create win-win solutions for the different actors involved. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time outlining this framework because the presentations this morning will mention some of these terms and will structure their presentation according to these aspects. So to give you a little bit more information on what's in store for you this morning, we're going to take the opportunity to take you on a little bit of a trip around the world this morning. We have the pleasure of having 7 of our alumni here from all around the world, and they've prepared a short presentation for you to outline the food systems context and situation in their country. These presentations will go for about an hour altogether, and after that we'll have a short amount of time for plenary questions. So we would ask that you just hold on to your questions to the end of the session. And then if there are one of the countries that's of particular interest to you or you have many more pressing questions, we would encourage you to then join the workshops which each of the groups will be hosting. So the workshops will happen in parallel, which means you'll have to make a very difficult decision which workshop you would like to join, but hopefully the presentations will help you get a bit of an insight into what you're going to be working on there. The workshops we have designed in a way that they're very, very interactive. We thought this is a dialogue on science, so we want to give you the opportunity to have that dialogue with one another. And so there'll be a lot of work from your side. So we thank you in advance for your willingness to participate this morning. So today's presentations will follow the basic format of having a look at the situation in each of these countries, understanding the context, the boundary conditions which we're operating with. It will then look at the status of the food system outcomes in that country. So as we mentioned before, food and nutrition security, environmental quality, and social well-being. We'll then take the opportunity to start to discuss some solution approaches, and that will then form the basis for the workshops which you'll move into later in this morning's session. As I mentioned, we're taking you on a journey around the world, and we'll be beginning that journey today in China. And I'm really pleased that Jiaqi Huang is able to join us. She was in our program in Switzerland last year. She's a research assistant at the Chinese Academy of Agricultural Sciences and just finished her Master of Science in Agricultural Economics. From China, we'll be taking you all the way to Kenya, where we're really happy to have Daniel Owino Wamunga with us. He's from the Kenyan Ministry of Agriculture and is an agro-processing officer there. He's also completing his Bachelor of Science in Food and Nutrition Dietetics at Kenyatta University in Nairobi. And he's joined by Jared Omondi Buoga, and Jared is the founder and director of the Timbea Youth Center for Sustainable Development, and he's also completing his Master of Science in Geoinformation Science at the University of Twente. After we hear from Daniel and Jared, we'll take you on a short stopover back here in Switzerland, where you're going to hear from Danielle Tendel, who's currently a postdoctoral researcher in the group of Sustainable Agro-Ecosystems of Johann Six at the ETH Zurich. And she's joined by Benjamin Groib, who's currently a program analyst at the FAO, but recently completed his Master of Arts in International Affairs and Governance at the University of St. Gallen. From Switzerland, we'll be taking you all the way over to the United States of America. You see the plane lands here in California because our two presenters are from there. Betsy Verhoeven, who's currently a PhD researcher, also in the group of Johann Six at the ETH Zurich, and Faris Mohammed, who's just finishing his Bachelor of Science in Environmental Policy at UC Berkeley. So as you can see, we have the opportunity to have a really diverse group of participants here today, and I would like to take the opportunity to sincerely thank the Academia Engelberg for giving us the opportunity to bring such a great group of our alumni here today to share their perspectives with you. We sincerely hope that you enjoy this morning's session. We thank you in advance for your participation in the workshops, and with that I would like to hand over to the first presenter. Thank you.
It's a great privilege to be here to present and discuss about Kenya. As an academician and a development practitioner, we are faced with a lot of disparities and realities when we get to implement projects on the ground. And today, our topic is challenges towards a food and nutrition secure future food systems approach to Kenyan situation. Kenya is a country of 40 million people, which is generally a youthful population. Between 75 to 80% of this population stays in the rural areas, and they have very small pieces of land that they are using for crop production. With rapid increase in the population, estimated at around 3% annual population growth rate, this subjects the agricultural landscapes to pressure, resulting in multiple and extensive subdivision of land, reducing the potentials of these landscapes due to these subdivisions, and subjecting the households to come up with various ways through which they can produce food. For instance, we have this multi-story gardening because of the small pieces of land. Looking at the country, and as a country that is about 75% arid and semi-arid, the FuseNet, that is the Famine Early Warning Systems Network that was formed by the USAID in the early 80s, classifies the country as currently in phase 2. The IPC, that is Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, that is a protocol that was developed by FAO to classify various regions and households based on the socioeconomic capacities to access food, to produce food, and their capacity to be resilient when there is weather variability. And in this case, as you can see, the red color represents an emergency zone, which is quite big, and the orange Kala is an area that is currently under warning. However, if you look at the lake region, the western part of Kenya, there is a band of that is classified as alert. However, the green part is classified as normal, but in the recent report, it's projected that we shall have low cereal harvest. This is due to long-term averages, due to low rainfall that was experienced in the previous season. Important to note is that these arid and semi-arid areas that are classified as emergency under warning or under alert are heavily inhabited by pastoralists. These are communities that highly depend on livestock and move from one region to another with their livestock in search of pasture and water. And in the recent past, we have experienced loss of cattle due to degradation in the pasture land, and this makes these households highly vulnerable. Looking at the health outcome, environmental outcomes due to these emerging food needs and environmental challenges that are posed by pressure as a result of food production system that we have, putting into play climate change, it has been observed that areas that were previously regarded as grain basket are shrinking. It's important to note that an emerging trend is occurring in these regions due to partnership between the government and international private sector, corporations to lease land out, and that is a problem of that poses reduction in areas of land that can be regarded as potential for food production. Looking at the way we are currently opening up forest land for agricultural production, this poses serious threat to the biodiversity. And as you know, potential degradation in biodiversity and loss of biodiversity causes food insecurity in a great deal, because environmental services that are essential for production and supporting agricultural production is threatened. Now I'll welcome my colleague to take you through the nutrition and food security outcomes.
Thank you. And just to add on the fact that food and nutrition security is a matter of great concern not only to the government of Kenya, but also the private practitioners. And that's why you see the kind of perspective you bring to both of us. Just to highlight the fact that from that graph, whose source is Kenya Demographic Health Survey, done between the government of Kenya, but commissioned by World Health Organization, it presents a worrying scenario in Kenya. From the left side of the slide, you notice that malnutrition manifests in undernutrition. And when we talk about undernutrition, we are talking about the deprivation of a population when they fail to get enough food. And of course, that can be extrapolated from the previous slides, when in a Kenyan family, the average size of arable land per family is 0.2 hectares. So that tells you that generally, food production is low compared to the farms in Europe and above. But so that malnutrition, in undernutrition, we have got the three forms. We have the stunting, underweight, and wasting. And of course, in stunting, we are referring to the low height for age, so that children who are suffering from stunting, they cannot grow to that adequate height, taking the average population of the children in a particular area. And of course, we have underweight, they have low weight, and wasting away because of lack of the necessary macro and micro elements. But on the flip side, it's quite interesting that a research done by Zariba and his team in 2009 indicates that 38% of the women in the urban areas are suffering from still another form of malnutrition, what we call overnutrition. And I will explain why that happens, and 18% of their counterparts in the rural areas. This scenario has been precipitated by two reasons. One, as we shall see in the preceding slides, Kenya as a nation has gone through population growth, we all know that, but also we are in a new constitutional dispensation. In this constitutional dispensation, the rights of the women is strongly entrenched in the Constitution to the extent that 1/3 of both elective and non-elective positions are reserved for women. What that translates into, we have the women workforce migrating into the urban centers, and because they are educated, they also go for the formal employment alongside their usual family care that they give to their families. So the Kenyan woman is under pressure to work to provide for his family, but also to cope up with the busy academic schedules, because when they go to town, they have to go for higher education to get higher pay and provide for the family. And so we see a scenario where the women in town are increasingly leading a more sedentary lifestyle, taking little attention to their nutritional needs. Hence the justification for that figure of 38% of obesity and overweight. And if you look at the Kenya television in East Africa and Africa, there's a lot of programs geared towards addressing the issue of overweight and obesity. In terms of social well-being, this is also another serious outcome of the food situation. From experience, whenever we do trainings, even as the government with the Ministry of Agriculture, we realize that 70% of our population are actually old women, to the point of 60, close to 70 years. To us, bearing in mind our lifespan of around 40 to 45, at 60, 65, they are considered old. This also happens for two reasons. Because of what I'd explained prior, the young women, because of the open democratic space and the opportunities in the urban centers, they go to the towns to compete for positions with their fellow male counterpart. So who is left in the village? It is the women of this age who are there to take care of themselves, but also to take care of the children who have been left behind. Who are the children who have been left behind? Before the new constitution, the Kenyan man used to be the one who was meant to provide for the family. So he would migrate to town, work, and send money in the village. But secondly, those left behind could be because of the natural calamities. What are they? We're talking of HIV, AIDS as a scourge, but also we are talking about other natural epidemics from time to time. So the Kenyan woman remains to be the sole provider in the village. And so these are some of the boundary conditions that we highlighted. Of course, there's encroachment, destruction of natural capital. Climate, we know there's a lot of initiatives in climate information research, but that information is not being disseminated well. Low budgetary allocation for the government, especially agriculture, unfavorable market for smallholder farmers. That you can see that most of the farms are smallholders. And of course, high-cost farm inputs alongside low appropriate technological know-how.
Well, now we ask ourselves, what is there for us in the future? And based on the fact that farming practices in our part of the world is carried by the families, we see a situation that we have to do intensification. Sustainable intensification, as described, as defined by Montelier panel report of 2013, state that is a pathway that strives to utilize existing land to produce greater yields, better nutrition, and a higher net income while reducing over-reliance on pesticide, fertilizer, and lowering emissions to harmful greenhouse gases. That put us in a situation that we have to explore opportunities that will enable us produce food, enhance value systems that are pro-poor and at low cost and effective at that level. Now, the center of decision-making in this framework that we propose or suggest is adapted from Montpellier panel report of 2013. It puts the farmer at the center. And looking at the small-size farms and coordinating these groups to organize groups, provision of appropriate and effective technologies and processes is of the essence for them to add value to what they produce and also to provide labor that is mechanized but appropriate and effective at that level. With the emergence of remote sensing and geographic information systems, availability of data, long-term data that is archived and free of charge, we are able to do analysis, do research, and come up with appropriate applications for early warning, such that we can know what are the farms, where are they, what are they producing. We can model crops to know how long will this season last and what are the appropriate crops to grow in those particular regions. And this information can be transmitted to the farmers using mobile phone, because mobile phone is in the hands of over 80% of Kenyan population. Moving further, capacity building is critical, and sharing of information among and between farmers is very important, because when farmers are trained on record keeping, they know what they have planted, when they have planted it, when to expect their harvesting date, and that information helps them in making decisions and also informing the market when their produce shall be available for sale. On the right-hand side of my panel here, we are emphasizing the need for domestic research and innovation. Research that inform local needs, research that bring closer the global technology and skills to be infused with indigenous knowledge for effective decision-making. Lastly, is about improvement of soil fertility using various approaches that are organic and effective and using locally available resources. So we take this opportunity to happily welcome you in our workshop so that we can have a deeper discussion and explore various platforms that we can use to enhance and streamline or even mainstream value chains and that will meet food security needs and nutritional needs of Kenyan population. Thank you so much.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm happy to welcome you to our presentation on the Swiss food system. For those of you who were here yesterday, you might have heard some of these things in the discussion yesterday, but I'm pretty sure we go a bit further, and I'm hoping that for all of you there'll be at least some parts that will be new or perspectives that you have not known before. As you see on here, what we will do is we will go basically through the format that Michelle was presenting before, with the boundary conditions of the system, the inputs, activities, and then with the outcomes of the Swiss food system. So without further ado, let's move forward. What are the boundary conditions of the Swiss food system? On the environmental conditions, one thing we have heard yesterday night is that Switzerland will be growing to 9 million, not billion, 9 million inhabitants by 2050. So what we can see here from 1850 to 2000 already is an incredible increase of population density in the country, because the amount of land available to live for people has not stayed the same, but hasn't increased as much as the population over the last 150 years. So what that means for agriculture and the wider food system is that there's less and less land, because, as you see in the picture, urban centers, here it is Bern, are more and more encroaching on agricultural land, leading to about 0.2% less agricultural land each year. What's the environmental policy perspective? Switzerland, as most of you will probably know, is a very vibrant democracy, and it came up with a lot of very ambitious environmental policies in the 1970s and 80s. Nonetheless, the pressures are very strong on the environment, so the implementation of all these policies has not always led to the outcomes that were wished for. If we move forward to the economic conditions of Switzerland, one thing that you will have heard yesterday is that we're heavily dependent on trade in food. We're a net food importing country. Even if we wanted to, we couldn't supply all the calories necessary. And also, if we look at the economy, you might think that this slide is wrong. Where is agriculture 100% of GDP? No, it's this little blue simmering line on the bottom that after 2000 you cannot even see anymore. This is the importance, only economically speaking, classical economics, of only agriculture, not the whole food system, but agriculture in the Swiss food system. What are the social conditions? If you're having a baby, it's probably very smart to have it here. The economists came up with this index that Switzerland is the place to be born in 2013. That's where your child will have the best expectancy of having success in life at the end of the day, whatever that means. And then if we look at the political conditions, this is probably one of the most peculiar parts of the Swiss food system, meaning that it's a semi-direct, some people still argue direct, I would say semi-direct democracy, where people are very much involved. There's a way where with 50,000 signatures, you can basically bring almost any decision by the parliament to a public vote, and if you find the double of that, 100,000 people supporting your cause, you can write anything you might want to do in the constitution. Which means that the whole government and the whole state system will have to adapt to it. It's a stable and functioning governance system, and there is a high level of participation. And it's really interesting that if you remember the GDP graph, there was no importance at all, but there are three initiatives almost at the same time on the same issue, which are all food and food system related. So one of them, for example, is this Fair Food Initiative. I think they already got all the necessary signatures together. It basically wants to make sure that the imported food has to go through the same regulations as Swiss food if it's comparable. And most of these initiatives also would like to increase the self-sufficiency of the Swiss food system and the Swiss agriculture mostly. So we really, really like our agriculture. What are the inputs we put into it? If we look at the natural resources, one thing I said, 35% of the land is agriculturally used. That's very high, especially if you look at right above the 35%, the unproductive areas where you can basically not produce anything, they're very high. So from the remaining land which you can do something with that isn't forests, 35% is quite a lot, but going down. If you look at the human-made inputs, the situation is very foreign dependent, so we have almost 80% of energy foreign dependency, and that's the one that is used in the food system, and 80% of it, once again, of the whole energy is non-renewable. Fertilizers, pesticide, machinery, seeds, most of it, you name it, are really mostly from abroad. With that, I will hand over to Danielle now, who will tell you a bit more about the activities and the outputs of the food system.
Thank you, Ben. So let's have a look at what the activities are in Switzerland concerning the food system. Well, our domestic production is composed of very small farms. The average farm size here is 18 hectares. 88% of our farms are family-run farms, and they work about 85% of our agricultural land. So maybe you can't quite call it smallholders, but it's looking more like that than you would have in the US, for example. We have a very lively food processing industry, ranging from very small dairies and bakeries in villages all the way up to huge multinationals. We met a few of them yesterday. And these multinationals in particular participate in a lot of our food exports. We don't have massive food exports, but we do have some very well-known products such as cheese products, chocolate of course, processed coffee. I think we're the world leader in exports of processed coffee. You can guess who produces that. And we also export baby foods. Our retail sector is highly concentrated. There are two major retailers who cover 70% of our market. Both of them are Swiss-based retailers, so they don't function in other countries in the world, or mainly in Switzerland, let's say. And they are both cooperative, so it's quite an interesting setup. We have 8 million citizens who consume food in Switzerland, and as you of course know, in Switzerland we are pretty well off, so we only have to spend around 7% of our budget for food consumed at home, and to that you can add another 5% of our budget for food consumed outside of the home. So basically we can buy our food very, very easily. We rely, as Ben was mentioning before, on a certain amount of food imports. That would be 40% of our food consumption. However, if you factor in our dependency on feed and fuel imports, which we rely on to produce our own food, actually our self-sufficiency is only 25%. There we rely on 75% equivalent of food imports. So actually we're not as self-sufficient as we would like to believe. This whole food system in Switzerland produces quite an amount of food waste. 30% of the food produced is wasted in Switzerland, and 50% of that waste is caused by the consumers. And that is probably related in part to the fact that we only have to pay a very small amount of money for food, so we can allow ourselves to waste a lot of food as well. Now let's look at the outcomes of our food system. I think we can say in Switzerland that we are generally pretty food secure. On that aspect, we are doing quite well. If you see in the statistics here of the FAO for Switzerland, you can see that the statistics on undernutrition aren't reported. We don't even bother to report them. That doesn't mean that there is no undernutrition going on. There are suggestions that senior citizens placed in medicalized care could suffer from relatively high prevalence rates of undernutrition and malnutrition. However, there are no clear numbers on this. And I think that is also due to the fact that we have a very well-functioning social security net system in Switzerland, which is used by about 77% of the population, but it functions pretty well. So there are very few people who fall through the cracks here. If we look at the health outcomes of our food system, here the picture is a bit bleak. We don't have undernutrition, but we clearly have overnutrition. Men aren't doing very well. They're around 50% overweight or obese in Switzerland nowadays. The trend has been increasing in the last years. Women are doing slightly better, but it's also increasing in the past years. And a second health outcome, which is related to the food system, not purely caused by it, but definitely related to it, is the major cause of death in Switzerland, which is the first box, this greeny yellowy color. That is cardiovascular diseases. That is related to diet, but also, of course, lifestyle. So that is the first cause of mortality in Switzerland. However, I would like to point out that our average death age in Switzerland is around 83 years. So you must set that in context with, for example, the age in Kenya, which was around 45 years. If we look at the environmental health outcomes of our food system, this is the ecological footprint of Switzerland. It shows you the total environmental impacts all lumped together of the entire activities in Switzerland. The green line would be what we should be doing if we were to be sustainable for the planet, and the orange line is what we are actually doing, so you can clearly see we're 5 times above. We're not doing very well environmentally. We're producing a lot of impacts. The share of the food system in that is probably around 1/3, so that would be the first colored 3 colored bars, which is all related to food production and the area used for that, plus a part of the carbon emissions, the big orange bar. So clearly the food system is having a serious contribution to our quite high environmental impacts. If we look at the social well-being outcomes, our food system provides 12% of the jobs in Switzerland, so it's really not negligible. However, we do have a problem in the agricultural sector. Again, the workload here is 60 hours per week compared to around 40 hours on average in Switzerland. And the income is 15 Swiss francs per hour. Again, internationally, this sounds like a lot, but if you look compared to Swiss standards, it's one of the very lowest salaries in Switzerland. For example, a student assistant at ETH would get around the double, 28 Swiss francs per hour. Economic outcomes, crop production value per hectare of land, as well as food and agricultural production per capita has been decreasing over the past years. Clearly, agriculture is not a booming economic sector in Switzerland, and it's actually not even economically viable. We are only able to maintain our agricultural production here because we agreed to pay 60% of agricultural income through subsidies through the government. And so why do we do that? Well, on one hand, there's our food self-sufficiency concerns, but we also recognize that agriculture in Switzerland does not only produce food and a small economic value, but it also provides other services such as maintaining landscapes, which are important for tourism. It also has a high cultural value, and it can support different forms of biodiversity if well done. So that was the overview of our Swiss food system, and now we'd like to introduce what we would talk about in our workshop. So our key question is how to make food systems more sustainable under multiple and unpredictable drivers of change. We all know we have huge challenges to face, so how can we deal with them all at once, and we don't even really know what's going to happen exactly. And the lens we would like to use here as a potential solution to be able to address these vast and very uncertain questions is to use the resilience lens. You've heard this buzzword crop up every now and then. A lot of people have picked it up. A lot of institutions and academic institutions have started working on this. I'd like to point out the SHARP project at FAO, which Ben has been working on, and here they've started looking into resilience for smallholder farmers. So what is resilience and why is it relevant? Well, first of all, as you realize, the food systems are exposed to multiple and very unpredictable drivers of change, shocks, disturbances, and so on, be they natural, political, economic, and so on. Secondly, our food systems are very complex nowadays, very interlinked, and thus meaning that it's very hard to predict what on earth is going to happen. So we can't just rely on traditional old modeling approaches. Thirdly, as we've seen, there are very different outcomes and often multiple trade-offs between those outcomes. And here again, it's hard to say, how can we make the system better for all of these conflicting outcomes? And here resilience would be useful because a resilient system, in 2 words, or a bit more, would be a built-in generic capacity to cope with highly uncertain disturbances, actions, and effects. So instead of optimizing your system for a predictable scenario, you try and build in a generic capacity to cope with whatever is going to crop up. And so if you come to our workshop, you will gain further insight into this resilience concept and why it is useful for decision-making in food systems. You will be able to experience live a part of the resilience building process and hopefully make it more tangible for you. And you will be able to provide us, and especially me, with feedback on an approach we're currently developing at the ETH Zurich on how to apply resilience assessment approaches in food systems. So I would very much welcome your input if you would like to join us in that workshop. Thank you very much.
Okay, well now Ferris and I will attempt the challenge of assessing food system outcomes in the United States. And to start with, then, I'll give you a little bit of an overview of the agricultural structure in the United States. And if you look on a nationwide level, our production systems, it's large and diverse, a bit like our population. So the average farm size in the United States is 175 hectares. So that's 10 times the average farm size that you just heard of in Switzerland. So our systems are, and there's many farms that are much larger than this. There are 2 main production regions in the United States, the heartland, which is in yellow, and that's where most of the corn and soy is grown. The other major production region is what we call the fruit-filled rim, and that's where there's a lot of production of high-value crops and high-input crops, such as vegetable, fruit, and nut production. But and our system, our agricultural system is productive. We export over $137 billion in agricultural products each year. And this, may or may not contribute to food security in other nations. And if that's something you're interested in, you can also come to our workshop. There's our plug. And we also import a lot of food as well, and mostly fresh fruits and vegetables and beverages. And so I want to ask, I think we all have an image of agriculture in the US in our head, and it's big monoculture farms, mechanization, and industrialized farming. And if we're uncomfortable with that image, we have to ask ourselves, what are we willing to pay for, and are we willing to work in a less mechanized agricultural system? And who would do that work? And so I think just to kind of keep that question in your mind as we go through the outcomes and we go through our presentation here. So you heard a lot about the environmental outcomes of agricultural production yesterday, so I'm not going to dwell too much here. But we are sitting in a situation where a lot of our systems are very reliant on inputs of fertilizers, chemicals, new seeds and new technology, pesticides, and water. And water is a huge issue, especially in the western United States. This fruit-filled rim is often not a water-filled rim. And so we are heavily extracting water from aquifers and watersheds to produce a lot of our food. We also have major issues with water pollution then from pesticides and fertilizers. We have problems with loss of ecosystem functioning and habitat degradation and soil degradation, which you heard a lot about yesterday. These inputs, of course, do produce a lot of food. We have high yielding and productive systems, so we can't undermine and forget that outcome of this. But as Danielle just mentioned, this concept of resilience, are we creating with all of these inputs an artificial environment for production and masking an increase in ecological vulnerability? And so do we have this built-in capacity that is necessary for resilience when we're talking about this reliance on inputs? So going into some of the social well-being outcomes of the food production system in the United States, we can look at where income is generated along the food chain and how that income is distributed. But for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to dwell on here the farm production scale, the farm production industry. And here we see about 10% of the value added to the total cost of a product occurs in this farm production category. And then we have to ask, what is the cost of inputs in this industry, and how many people are involved? And so I talked about a bunch of the inputs in the previous slide. The other major input is labor. And we have over 1 million farmers in the United States, but we have over 3 million farm laborers. And what is this difference between farm laborer and farm operator? Farm operators, they show up on our census reports. They're mostly citizens, and they're mostly white. And in contrast, we rely heavily on a lot of farm labor, which is these are the people doing low-paying manual labor jobs in fruit and vegetable production, in the poultry industry. They're predominantly foreign-born. Many of them are coming from Mexico, and over half of them are undocumented, and they're working at really, really minimum pay. Over 60% of farm labor is living below the poverty line. And so as we are pushing our systems to produce more with less and at always ever and ever cheaper, we're relying on an exploitation of inputs, and one of that is certainly labor. So now the crux of what this conference is about also is food and nutrition security outcomes. Nearly 20% of Americans are food insecure. They are in some way relying on federal food assistance then. At the same time, we also have over half of our population is overweight, and a quarter of our population is obese. And oftentimes these are happening in the same families and in the same communities. So in contrast to maybe Kenya and China, which you heard from, this diet-related health burdens are disproportionately affecting low-income communities and families in the United States. And how is this occurring? We'll take a look at the 4 pillars of food security. Availability of sufficient food, yes. Availability of nutritious food, not always. And you can look at this graph here, and it shows the top 4 sources of calories for low-income families, and 3 of the 4 are coming from a grain-based diet, and the top one is sodas and sugary drinks. I mean, is this even a food? Why are people consuming so much of this? It's cheap. It's incredibly cheap. Nutritious foods cost more, and there's an inverse relationship between the calorie content and the cost of a food. And access, so that's the economic access. We also have issues with geographical and physical access. And in the US, that often means, do you have a car? We don't have this wonderful public transport system as we do in Switzerland, and we have a much larger nation too. So people do not always have access to fresh and unprocessed foods in grocery stores. And so the combination of this economic and physical access is, well, when you're lacking both of this economic and physical access, you end up with this term food desert, which is low income and low access. And we also have issues of use, and some of this is, do you have the ability and the capacity to store and prepare food? Do you have a stable living situation and a kitchen? Not all low income families have this. And some of the same cultural and time pressures that we heard about and we know about from maybe your own societies here and shifting. We have less and less time to prepare food. And the last one is stability, and that is, stability in personal incomes and job security. It's also stability in, these federal and these assistance programs that cycle with economic cycles and cycle with election cycles. So there's quite a. And now, just to kind of wrap up this look at the outcomes of our food system, I can give you 2 examples within the agricultural sector. And one is biofuels, and that we have this environmental policy meant to, in part alleviate some of our reliance on fossil fuels. This has direct implications for food and nutrition security, and food production also has ramifications again to the environment. And the other one is looking at vegetable and fruit production. We want people to eat more fruits and vegetables. At the same time, these require water inputs and labor inputs. So can we achieve the production in an ecologically sustainable way and in an ethical way?
Great. So now that Betsy has given you a nice overview of some of the drivers and the outcomes of the food system, we want to focus the next half of the presentation on the many stakeholders in the US food system. So the US food system is very complex, and there are tons of stakeholders. But for the sake of time, we have grouped them into 3 categories: the private sector, government, and non-governmental organizations. However, today we will focus our attention on the government actors, including the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, the USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture, and USAID. Though we will aim to focus on these government actors, we want to stress that all individual actors in this system are not static. This is a dynamic system with multiple actors constantly acting on each other, influencing the choices and decisions of other actors. So as Betsy mentioned, we are very fortunate to live in the United States, where there's no shortage of food supply. This is largely a result of the Green Revolution, a period where new agricultural technologies, including high-yielding seed varieties, hybrid seeds, mechanization, and the increased use of fertilizers and pesticides, led to an unprecedented increase in yield. The Green Revolution mentality is still very prevalent in US agricultural policy today. In a sense, we have just kind of expanded on those Green Revolution technologies with the same intention to continue maximizing yields. However, yield maximization was only possible with a few select crops, and I think the most well-known are corn and soy. Coincidentally, our workshop card is also yellow, just like corn. However, these technologies seem to have worked a little bit too well in the United States, and that led to farmers overproducing these commodities without establishing markets to sell this surplus first. Overproduction eventually drove prices down and farmers went bankrupt. Public Law 480, PL 480, was a government assistance program following the destruction of Europe after World War II. The program states that the government would purchase the surplus from US farmers to send overseas to rebuild Europe. Unfortunately, Europe eventually stabilized, and the US was left once again with all this surplus and nowhere to send it. PL 480 was renamed Food for Peace, which continued to mandate the government purchase this surplus. However, the surplus was then sent to developing countries who were facing food insecurity. Now, the effectiveness of these programs is debatable. However, food aid from USAID, the largest aid organization in the world, plays a crucial role in mitigating the impacts of natural disasters and conflicts in these developing countries. Food for Peace is an additional subsidy for US farmers. However, the USDA also allocates an additional $20 billion from the federal budget for agriculture. These subsidies encourage overproduction and unsustainable management practices. Additionally, over 2/3 of the subsidies goes to only 10% of the farmers in the US. So I know what you're all probably thinking. How do these subsidies not violate free trade agreements? Well, they do, and lots of countries were very unhappy with us. In fact, Brazil brought the US to the WTO and argued that US subsidies were giving US producers unfair advantages over local producers. Cheap imports from the US would come in and outcompete local producers. The 2014 US Farm Bill attempted to address some of these accusations, sort of. And the Farm Bill is this umbrella policy that is a multi-sectoral policy that is debated in Congress every 4 years to account for new changes, climate change, new changes in science and technology. In response to Brazil, the Farm Bill eliminated direct payment subsidies for farmers, however, continued this trend of farmer insurance. So farmers are able to purchase insurance from private companies at a lower rate that is subsidized by the government. So for the sake of time, I won't get into the many different aspects that the Farm Bill touches on, but what's really important about this is that it does draw on every single aspect of the food chain. So this could be an advantage because you have all of these different stakeholders coming together, working really nicely to come to some kind of consensus. Unfortunately, this is also a problem with rising inequality in the US, and now we are seeing that some interests are taking priority over others. So the government is supposed to represent both civil society and industry. However, if we look at industry spending alone on lobbying, we can see vast inequality between civil society and industry. And industry clearly has the advantage. In 2013, 350 companies spent over $150 million on lobbying for this one policy. US food policy is also heavily criticized for its revolving door politics. The most notable example is the appointment of the head of the FDA, who just happens to be a former vice president for Monsanto. Coincidentally, efforts to require labeling of GMO products in the US have failed to win support from the FDA. So the revolving door policy is this process where wealthy individuals from private companies essentially buy a seat in Congress, push industry interests in Congress. Then after their term expires, they return to their corporation where they are greeted as heroes and welcomed with bonuses. This does beg the question of who is deciding our food policy, and are these the interests that we want to maintain? That is not to say that civil society is completely powerless. The demonstrations of fast food workers in the US prove that civil society does have the ability to bring these issues to the government. So finally, we have seen some solutions in the US. However, these solutions have largely focused on one target area. And so we see organic farming and organic pest management and drought-tolerant crops used to address environmental health outcomes. We see fortification, biofortification, and genetic engineering as a solution to food and nutrition security. And then we have these social campaigns like Michelle Obama's Let's Move campaign that are really aimed at schools, young children, and reestablishing good eating practices. But what we haven't seen in the US is a solution that really addresses these three outcomes. As Betsy had mentioned, these outcomes are interrelated and all connected with each other. So it's very important that we find a solution that touches on these three areas. So we would love to invite you to our workshop where hopefully you will come up with some solutions that address these target areas. And thank you for your time, and look out for that yellow corn card. That's us. Thank you. I'm not sure.
So I'd like to take the opportunity to thank our contributors this morning so very much. As you could imagine, it was quite a task that we gave them to summarize everything in their country in 15 minutes, and I think they did a phenomenal task. So another round of applause for them. We have around 20 minutes now to accept some questions from the audience, so I'd like to invite all of our speakers back up to the stage. And those of you that have some questions, if you would like to prepare them. Okay. Wonderful. So we'd like to open up to questions from the audience. If you could please bear in mind the question of time and formulate your questions in a way that are nice and short and to the point, and try and get a response from our presenters here. They're sitting together in the groups that they've presented, so if you would like to direct the question either to an individual or a country, that would also be helpful. We'll begin over here.
In fact, the first two contributions reminded me of a discussion I had with a member of the Chinese Academy of Sciences in the committee of the Chinese Academy of Sciences 10 years ago. And he was very critical to his government. He was very critical to industry in general. I have to say he was a physicist who had been professor at Berkeley and back in China. And this person identified the main problem, as you did in your first two presentations, as the issue of the rural to urban migration. He said not only the problem of nutrition will be the issue, also the social stability and so on. And my question is, what type of, let's say, measure should governments take to put a brake on this type of rural to urban migration?
Questions for Jyoti.
Thank you for your question. Could I understand your question as what the government do to solve this kind of rapid urbanization problem? Is that right?
Yes. In fact, his opinion, it's not my opinion, his opinion was the fact that the technology is, let's say, overwhelming the issues. And people from the rural part will always try to go to the cities in order to have the feeling to get a better life, which is not the case in many situations. And this is, he said, in fact, the government in general, not only China, but in South America, in Africa as well, are let's say, promoting this type of migration. And this is due to the fact that also industry is doing nothing to do, let's say, to foster issues in rural vicinities. You understand what I mean?
So the question, what is the role of different actors in curbing rural to urban migration in China?
In China and in other countries, because if you solve this problem, you will solve partially food, you will solve social stability, and so on.
So perhaps we'll give Jiaqi an opportunity to respond to that, and then if anybody else would like to add to it. So what's the role of different actors in curbing rural to urban migration in China?
Okay. Should I? Okay. I want to ask that actually in China, the government is want to push this trend. I mean, push this urbanization trend because they treat this as the way for China to develop. But the problem is here is that they didn't treat this kind of trend as to develop agriculture in rural or in village. They just want to solve this kind of social protection policy in rural areas. That means how to make more service for these migrant people to make them better, with better living conditions in urban areas, such as like improve a lot of education opportunities for these migrants' children to study in cities. I mean, yeah, it's very important for Chinese government to also improve the situation in rural, but for now it's just like encourage them to migrate to urban again. Yeah.
Yes? So I think that's also a very big topic that you'll have the opportunity to discuss further in the workshop if you would like to delve deeper into it. Question at the back here, Ros?
Yeah, great, really good presentations, you guys, so informative. So I'd like to put on one topic for discussion, just maybe in the sessions or later, and it related to all, so I don't think you'll be able to answer it. And then I had one specific question. You know, I was thinking about resilience last night, and you raised it all again today, and I'm wondering what we collectively think about whether diversity, you know, that builds resilience is better done at the farm level, every farm does it, or at the food system levels, assuming that we have trade between and within regions, and you can get some specialization and increased productivity if it's better at that scale. So the scale, I think, is interesting. And then, of course, I was reminded by some of your talks, maybe resilience is also built by a balance between farm and off-farm income. I noticed in Kenya in particular, the most successful farmers were ones that had a little bit of a backdrop of somebody in the household working off-farm. So that's just for discussion, but a targeted question on the U.S. You mentioned the farm policies. It certainly goes back long before the 50s, and even in the 20s, they were building policies to lead to the surpluses. You didn't talk much about the omnibus bill. I mean, it's really phenomenal. We get something as large as the Farm Bill passed when nothing else passes in our legislature. And by far the overwhelming area of expenditures is on the consumer side. So I was wondering if you could say something about that.
Yeah, I could hand this over to Ferris, but I think it is true that the nutrition assistance programs is also part of the USDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and within the Farm Bill. And I think it's almost 70 to 80% of the Farm Bill funding goes into food and nutrition assistance programs. These are like vouchers. They're also school lunch programs, and you know, maybe we really need to think of better ways to support farmers through these kind of payments that then they're feeding into the nutrition, I think, feeding back into these, so that it's more direct between the farmer and this nutrition assistance program as well. I don't know.
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, U.S. agricultural policy history is just so dense. We really had to cut a lot of stuff. But I think the point that you raised is really interesting, that the U.S. is kind of known for having all of these policies that never go anywhere. They get stuck, they get revised. But the Farm Bill is like this massive, massive multi-sectoral policy that actually does get pushed forward. And I think that just has to do with the fact that it is dealing with the federal budget and allocation to these funds. And so that's really why you have these stakeholders pushing this bill forward.
I believe that's also another topic you'll get to explore in their workshop.
Yeah, more of that in the workshop for sure.
Okay, the next question at the front here. Or, sorry, sir, you already have the microphone.
Thank you. My name is Bernd Ludermann. I'm editor of a third world magazine called Weltsichten, and I have a comment more to the first question. In my view, the first question is fundamentally flawed because it seems to be based on the assumption that you should stop urbanization. But in my view, that is neither possible nor desirable. I would say that in a case like you have in Kenya, we have been hearing that there is very small farms, and the farm size is actually shrinking. In that situation, what you can do, like you see in China, is allowing urbanization and creating jobs outside of agriculture. And that is something China did much better than Kenya, not only increasing yields, but also creating extra agricultural jobs. And I think we should not forget this and think about just stopping urbanization. Thank you.
Thank you. Lily? Sorry, first you and then Lily.
There is Keller, Switzerland. There is one issue which I think has not been discussed is the prevention of the obesity problem when establishing food security. We heard that in most countries where food security has improved, there is also this increasing prevalence of obesity. And many people, like in China or in Kenya, could be fed or undernourishment could be diminished when preventing obesity just by improved distribution of the nutrients and also by a different choice of specific nutrients. And I think we just heard from the American presentation that certain types of food make people more likely to become obese and others less. So food policy and food security should always also, in my mind, include a strategy how to prevent obesity in establishing or in making food with lower energy density, for instance, available, or enhance the production of more plant-derived foods like vegetables and fruits. So I think this aspect has not been discussed today and yesterday sufficiently.
Do you have a specific question for one of the,
Not
is this
really.
more a comment?
I just heard nothing about this from the Kenyan and from the Chinese presentation, only from the American presentation.
Mm-hmm. That's also another topic they'll explore in more depth, but perhaps you would like to comment on that, this paradox between.
Okay, thank you so much for that concern and question. I did mention about it in brief on obesity and overweight because of the rural to urban migration and the increasing pressure, especially on the women. And as a government, Ministry of Agriculture has programs. One of them we call Urban and Peri-Urban Agriculture, UPAP, that mainly works in the urban centers to ensure that they diversify their diet by having what we call the multi-storage gardens, so that the town people can also grow vegetables alongside consuming meat. And of course, we know of the progressive impact that it has. Thank you.
Okay, my question is also in that field of United States. 55% overweight and 25% is obese. And you mentioned it needs cultural change. But from management theory, we know cultural change is the hardest change. Structural change, strategy change, that's easier. And so I would ask you, the two representatives of the United States, who could be the drivers of that change? What are the conflicting interests there? And who are real promoters of it? You have the best universities, but there must be other enemies and opponents to that real change. Heavy economic interests. What is your explanation that this catastrophe is existing?
Yeah, so I think when we're talking about change in the US, the majority of programs have been definitely top-down, where either the government or a corporation or whoever in power is kind of forcing this change onto people and communities. So I would say I do not have the solution for you. However, there are grassroots organizations in the US that are really trying to start at the community level and start with that cultural change and really let the communities and the people most affected be the voice of the change that they want and speak for themselves. And so, I mean, possibly the best structural change that we can implement would just be to, give these communities the resources they need to make these decisions for themselves and not just, shove all of this information at them at once.
Yeah, I guess I also think, I mean, maybe it's a way out, but the change has to come from within, and I think in terms of like what kind of agricultural production we subsidize, we can think really hard about what we do subsidize, and if we want, and we can incentivize more production of other crops and a diverser array of crops, and in a wider region, in regions where it hasn't been economically viable to grow vegetables for a while because, now because they can't get them early enough on the market to compete with produce from California and Florida. And so making fresh produce more locally available at a bigger scale, I think, is one thing. And I think, I think that it's part of a much bigger system. And in terms of cultural change, I mean, we need to, when people are short on time and short on money, and then they make decisions about their health. And so, and I mean, I think we need to people need to think about their priorities if they can, and where you're going to invest your time. And we do that, everybody on a personal level. How much do you want to work? Or how much do you have to work? And because the amount of free time you have that really dictates your ability to cook and prepare food and to take care of your health and to exercise. And I think, so on an even macro level, I don't know, that we need to think about our priorities.
And I think that any cultural change would happen incrementally anyway. And even you can see in the US now, the demand for exotic fruits and vegetables has gone up, which was not culturally relevant years ago. So I think that change does happen.
Thank you both. Daniela would also like to add something from the Swiss perspective.
I obviously can't talk for the USA, but what I can talk about is some examples from other countries, including Switzerland. I just think there's no easy answer to your question. I think everybody can contribute something to this huge change, which I totally agree with you is the hardest change ever to make. I don't know if you know about the obesity foresight study, which was done in the UK recently, and they tried to map the system and all the factors which were influencing the increase in obesity or which could contribute to decreasing obesity rates. And that map was insanely complex. I mean, you would need to spend 2 hours just going through the lines to see what was happening. So there is no easy answer. And I think here it's just interesting to think that there's some very unexpected or alternative sources where change could start happening as well. And here I'd like to take a few examples from Switzerland. One thing which came to my mind is the recent boom we've had in local domestic tourism, people going to the mountains. I know about this because I've been going for quite some years, and we used to be pretty much alone on the mountaintops, and nowadays there's a crowd up there. And this is the tourism industry and the sports clothing, equipment, marketing industry which has driven this, and they've done an amazingly successful job in their area. And I believe that that has probably contributed, not that we're doing very well on obesity, but it might contribute to changing our lifestyle and our culture. We get out and we move much more. Another point is, as Betsy was pointing out, the lifestyle. We have long working hours in Switzerland. We have a pretty high rate of burnouts, even suicide, sadly, due to the stress that we experience at work. So this, again, will be driving what kind of food we eat and the kind of junk food that we'll be swallowing to try and face all this stress. And the last thing that I'd like to point out that, again, I think we're not doing too badly in Switzerland is that we have education on nutrition and health from a very, very early age. This is part of the official program in Switzerland from primary school, from year 4, when kids are maybe 8 or something. And so this, again, might be a part of the solution. I'm not sure if that's the case in the US, but I think it's something which is very valuable here.
Thank you, Danielle. We have time for 2 more questions. So firstly, Akash, and then at the front here.
Thank you, Michelle, for chairing such a wonderful panel. Benjamin and Daniel, you guys haven't got any questions yet, so this is to Switzerland. My name is Akash Arasu. I represent the organization REACH, based in Zurich. And we come from an economic perspective, and I was really curious as to what your views were on Switzerland's agricultural policy, especially in terms of subsidization. Swiss farmers are one of the most highly subsidized in the world. Up to 70% of their income comes from public money. And I was wondering what concern this comes from. Is it more from a food security perspective that Switzerland's concerned about self-sustaining its food security, or is it more just simply a very powerful agricultural lobby? Thank you.
Ben, would you like to take that?
I think it's a very difficult question to answer because the problem is, at the end of the day, most people, nobody is really budging up against these subsidies, so we can say that people are fairly okay with them. But the decision at the end, of course, is only done on the level of the parliament. I personally believe it's a mix of both. It's if you look at the percentage of people in Switzerland who are farmers and the percentage of parliamentarians who are farmers, it's not even just lobbying, it's a very high overrepresentation. The same with lawyers, though. But then secondly, if you actually look at why, also, and really interestingly in trade negotiations, how Switzerland has defended this, it is this concept in the 1990s especially of multifunctionality of agriculture. Of saying, well, it's not just that we would like to protect our own markets, but we also believe that there is an inherent positive effect of doing agriculture the way we're doing it for the environment, partially even on the social perspective. That's a bit my view on that. So I would say it's a mixed picture. I personally have not seen, apart from liberal economists, there's not a lot of opposition to that. Also, of course, as an economist, you know, it's really hard to organize very big groups, such as 7 million consumers, and much easier to organize 2 or 3% of the population who are farmers.
I'm sorry, sir. We had the last question at the front here.
I'd just like to say something for the farmers, you know. The subsidies that we have been paid for the financial sector in Switzerland, in Europe, and all over the world are much more important than the subsidies we paid for the farmers. Worldwide, we are subsidizing the financial sector instead of giving this money to the farmers. That's what's happening really.
Sure, and this is another very big topic, and if we would like to discuss that more, I would suggest that you go to the Swiss workshop. I would just like to move to the last question now before we break for the workshops.
Thank you very much. I was so delighted by all your presentations. I'd like to come to all your workshops. But since I am tomorrow speaking on Swiss food security, I'll come to the Swiss workshop first. But anybody else, I've been lecturing and publishing on all your countries also on food security for the last 7 years. So just ask me. And I know a few things on WTO because I do food safety panels in the WTO as a judge, as a panelist. I have 3 quick questions to the 3 other countries. And then I'll take the Swiss up. Swiss bashing is my specialty. On Kenya, you're one of the first countries where the right to food was inscribed in your constitution. And I wonder whether you can say anything, whether that has an impact on practical policies and results in the field. And when you look at some parts of Kenya, before you come to Nairobi from the south, you have big cash crop farms, cattle, for instance. You have also still big, successful vegetable, coffee, and other production in Kenya. Has that a contribution, positive or negative, to food security at the national, at the household level? In China...
I'm sorry, so could we stop there and let them respond, and then we can go to the next question one by one?
Just quickly. Just China, one quip. Your new president made a big announcement that agricultural policies would be reformed, especially in terms of land tenure. What has happened for land tenure? Can I buy, as a Chinese farmer, can I buy my land and things like that? On the US, you described WTO, I don't know exactly how. You have limits today on subsidies, but you also have no limits on food aid. How do you think WTO could contribute to better farm policies in the US? Thank you very much.
Okay, so we'll bring in quickly with Kenya. Would you like to respond?
Thank you so much for the question. I'll respond this way, that cash crop have no much impact on the food security because the land under cash crop, for example, tea, coffee, and other related cash crops, which are meant for export, do not have so much impact on the food security. However, regions that have been previously producing maize and other cereals that are the staple food are facing a lot of challenges. One is that there's a new disease for maize that in the last two seasons wiped up maize in Trans-Nzoia, which is a challenge to food security in that manner. And additionally, moving toward the south and eastern part of Kenya, where there's a lot of pastoralism, the pastoralists are being pushed away because of market pressures due to emergence of payment for ecosystem services that are encouraging ranch and rangeland owners to adopt wildlife conservation, and this put them to the fringes and put pressure on small rangelands. So already those are some of the things that we are facing. And additionally, if you go towards the coastal areas, the lease of land to Qatari government over 500,000 hectares for production of biofuels and sugar makes areas that locals herd cattle or produce subsistence food crops to become smaller, and they are pushed away to fringes. Yeah.
Thank you. For China, actually, you cannot buy land from other farmers because the land belongs to the government. So the farmers only privilege of use the land or farm on the land. So the Chinese government is actually now improve the farmers to rent their land to big producers or to large farm companies to realize a kind of large-scale farming. So you cannot buy land from other farmers, just rent.
Thanks, Chachi. United States?
And I think the question of the WTO in the U.S., will the WTO come down on the U.S. for food aid? And I think the answer is no, just because, I mean, the only thing I could imagine that would change that is the rise of the basic and the BRIC countries becoming more economically developed and then probably taking a larger share of that food aid market, or possibly just rising incomes all around the world might release that. But I don't see the USAID policies disappearing anytime soon.
Thanks a lot, Faris. Thank you all very much for your insights. So again, I'd like to thank all our contributors, and we warmly welcome you to the workshops, and we hope you enjoy the rest of the morning. Thank you very much.